Zenglop the Podcast. Conversations with an Aesthetic Alien. A podcast where we talk about music, poetry, and psychogeography. Yeah, I don't know if it's important. It's probably not important to say this, but if I were to say where my NFL football, my football affiliation lies, it's probably with the New England Patriots. Even though I've lived in Pittsburgh for 25 years. But they were formative years that I lived in Maine, and I have some very good memories associated with watching Patriots football. And I do think Tom Brady is awesome. So now we've got that out of the way. Let's get back to business here. A couple of follow-up things. First, I was looking at my podcast stats on Spreaker, which is the platform that I use to host the files for the podcast, and I noticed that on February the 2nd, more people downloaded an episode of the podcast than typically happens in a single week. So I don't know if it's that there was some kind of Russian hack that got involved, but about half of these came from iTunes, about half of them came from the iPhone. None of them came from the Spreaker website, which is unusual because typically what happens is people get to the podcast through the links that I send out. And I link directly to Spreaker there. So I don't know. I can't tell on the app here whether it's a particular episode. I could probably log in to the laptop and do that. I don't know if it was, a couple of people downloaded every single episode. Let's say that's what it was. Let's say I really touched a couple of people and they went in and downloaded every single episode in the archive. And I'm now spending the week listening to it. I won't do that. But I have been posting more on YouTube, and YouTube just has a larger audience. I get, 10 times as many clicks and views on YouTube as I do for the podcast. So maybe I got lucky there as well. In a couple of the videos where I do link in the information in the videos, I link to the podcast. Maybe that brought some traffic to the podcast as well. I mean, that was certainly the intention, or one of the goals of the YouTube channel was to pull people in with a broad net and then get the interested people to listen to the podcast. Maybe that's working. On the YouTube channel, if you haven't gone and checked it out, go check it out. There's a couple of playlists that I'm updating regularly. One of them is a weekly set called the Urban Bellabok, which is my exploration of the neighborhood, the city, with my very low frequency receiver, which I've talked about in several episodes, including the very first Zenglop podcast, where I take this device that's tuned to a very low frequency, around 60 hertz. If I were out in the desert or far away from civilization, I would pick up something called spherics, which are electromagnetic disturbances in the Earth's atmosphere caused by lightning strikes that then travel through the atmosphere, and they cause these little chirping sounds. But in the city, the electric grid, all of the wires and whatnot, also resonate at that same frequency. So all you pick up in the city is this unrelenting wall of sound. And rather than be disappointed in that, which I was for many years, I've decided that this is an artifact that's interesting in itself. And it is kind of interesting. If you listen, there's 3 episodes up there now. I'm going to do one a week for, the next couple of months, and then we'll see what happens. But the sound of that grid is a really interesting drone, and it changes depending on how I move. So go check that out. But I've also started, meaning that I've done one, but I'm going to start doing more video of me playing the piano and building up gradually electronics around the piano. So I have a very simple setup in one of these videos where I produce a sine wave on a transducer. That's a special kind of piezo electric that I place on the soundboard, actually on the strings of the piano, and it makes whatever surface it's in touch with vibrate with whatever. So you can use it as a speaker. You can put it on a table, and the table will resonate with the sound. In this case, I ran a sine wave into the piano and then recorded it. In fact, let me bring in a couple of snippets here, because it's interesting. Some of the sounds are very basic. The sine wave through the soundboard. Then depending on whether I place certain notes, you can hear different sounds. The up and down of the pedal makes a difference. Because the transducer is on the string, it's dampening that string in kind of a partial way, so it sounds like a kind of a prepared piano. I play down there, and I found that it sounded good a couple of octaves higher up if I dampened that string with my finger and then played. So you know, there's different sounds. I need to work on my video production the same way I need to work on my sound production, but that will come, right? That will come. So you definitely go check out the YouTube channel. You can look for Zenglop, or you can look for Andrew Kaiser, composer, and you'll find, or you can search for the Urban Belleboke, Beleboke. That almost was the name of this podcast, the Urban Belleboke. But I like it as a series of videos. I think it works well. In fact, last week I was up at the Water Tower, which was another early episode. So you can see how this really ties in a lot of my interests and fascinations into a nice little series of videos. What else? Let's see. I picked a tarot card this morning because I was thinking about something, and I have often used tarot cards for decision making. So it's probably worth talking about that a little bit, because I say often, but I would probably not in the last 10 or 15 years have I done anything. But up until then, from when I was a young person, a teenager, or in high school, until my late 30s, was very, very engaged with tarot decks, with different tarot decks and different ways of using them and studying them, reading them for myself, reading them for other people, thinking about tarot deck as sort of Kabbalistic. The first deck I ever got was the Aleister Crowley Thoth deck, which may not have been the best first deck for a 16 or 17-year-old kid, but I remember taking it with me to college, and I don't remember the details behind this, although I suspect that liquor was involved. But at one point, I got so freaked out by something that had happened with them, that I actually threw the whole deck away. And I'm not making this up, no shit. A couple of days later, the deck appeared in front of my dorm room because whoever had, taken the garbage out, it was one of those dumpsters. I mean, I'd seen these, I guess known they were mine, and brought them and put them back, put them by my door. Or they dematerialized out of the garbage and rematerialized by the door. And eventually I got familiar with the deck and came to appreciate its beauty and its sort of richness of imagery. But the Thoth deck is a big deck with a lot of stuff in it. I never really used the Writer, you know what I mean? It's when everyone used the Writer, sort of the late Victorian deck. I never really used that one, but I used many decks that were obviously derived from that, but that would take that what became sort of a standard imagery, right? And all of that standardization is really pretty recent. I mean, I liked reading about traditions of tarot that go back thousands of years, that they're Egyptian hermetics, but none of that's real, except in the sense that the decks, people relatively recently, in the last 50 years or whatever, used the deck as a structure to put their own insight and wisdom onto it. And I appreciate that and found it useful. I do think that the deck, particularly the major arcana, line up with Jungian archetypes. I find that very useful to think about the deck that way. But I also recognize that the tarot deck is really a playing card deck that just had a different set of major cards in it than the deck that we're familiar with now. But acts like a precipitant, right? Like a seed, and then all around it, all these other traditions and glom onto it, and that becomes very rich and very useful. I mean, I feel that way about many, if not all, divination tools that I'm familiar with. Is that it's not so much the tool itself as it's an excuse or an opportunity for your wider self, your unconscious, whatever you want to call it, to apply itself to something and bring forth insight that way. It could be a bunch of stones, it could be cards, it could be a broken egg, it could really be anything, as long as it's approached in a way that says, here, unconscious archetypes, here's something for you to think about in a way that's totally different from how I think about anything else. So the decks, when I would read for other people, it wasn't so much memorizing what each card means, although that's a useful thing to do, but it felt important that if a card came up, what stands out in that card, whatever design or pattern is involved in it, what stands out to the person who's having the card read, and then use that to put together a story with the different cards. So it wouldn't matter so much what the Seven of Swords meant specifically, except what's in that card that jumps out. So I used a deck that was based on sort of Arthurian's quasi-Celtic mythology, put together by John and Caitlin Matthews. And I used that deck a lot. I found the images beautiful, which is important. I found they resonated, and I found that I could always tell a story when the cards were laid out, whether I used sort of a formal layout, there are many different types, or whether I just put a couple of cards down to see the connections. So I started with the Thoth deck. I used this Arthurian deck for a long time. I liked very much a deck called the Osho Zen deck, That was probably towards the end of my involvement with tarot. I was using that. I wouldn't say involvement with tarot. I just mean that at a certain point, not deliberately or consciously, I just stopped using them. It was probably when I first really took meditation practice in the Bon tradition. I think probably a lot of the tools or ideas that I had been working with, gradually I focused more on the elements within that one tradition. So anyway, it's interesting now that I am looking at a card. It's actually a deck called the Old English deck. So you see what I mean? The decks, the structure of the deck is standard, but the imagery that goes into them, there's thousands now, and they're all important and useful. And I think it's important, but it's important to distinguish the design from the elements, and find a deck with a design that you find beautiful, and then use that one. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. So this one's called the Old English deck. It was actually given to me as a Christmas gift by my friend Maria. And when she gave it to me, it struck me this was an interesting moment. It was an opportunity for me to rethink or to re-engage with that. So I knew then that I was going to start to think about tarot decks again. And between the two of us, my wife and I have dozens of decks and dozens of books about tarot, how to use them, exercise workbooks, different meditations. So I went into our library and I found this one book here by Gareth Knight called Tarot and Magic, Images for Rituals and Pathworking. And I have to say, probably the base ideas I have about tarot and how to use it probably all come from this book. It's a fantastic book, and what I remember from it is that each card has a visualization, and I remember recording the visualizations onto a cassette, and then doing what I can now see as sort of stillness exercises first, take a nice hot bath, and then go to a clean room, put some clean clothes on, which back then when I was a graduate student, neither of those two things were guaranteed. And then I'd put the cassette back on and I would play back, and it was me reading and it sounded a bit hokey, but each card had a narrative, a story behind it, and then the connections, and some of it was based on the Kabbalistic tree of life, how the different cards interacted with each other. It was great. I just felt like it was really pulling together a lot of different threads. He has a couple of books, or at least we have a couple of books that he wrote. I'm sure he's written many more. So what prompted me to actually open the deck today is that I've been going back and forth about a situation at work where the program that I've been working on for 3 years is wrapping up, and there's more coming in the same group that I'm in. It's not that I'm worried that means that my job is over, but there's definitely a period of transition now, and there's an opportunity in another group with people I've worked with before, and it's close to the group that I'm in now, so it's not like uprooting and having to create a whole new network, which I really don't think I could do now. When the last time I changed positions, moved companies to get back here to where I am now, it was so disruptive. I thought, I'm just too old for this shit. But this would be kind of it would be a comfortable move in terms of people that I already know, part of my network. But it would be a whole new shift. It actually would be a different program altogether. And it's big, and it would be challenging. And it's now, and it's clear, and it's there. But it means leaving this group that I've built up a reputation, and a good reputation, and something will come this year. And in the meantime, I'm certainly busy, but it's obviously a period of transition. So I wanted to know what would it be to pursue this new position. So, and again, this is where I do think tarot or other tools allow the brain to operate in a different mechanism, right? A mechanism that's not just my body and my fist. So when I'm shuffling the cards, I'm really thinking about this very tangible step, like sending this email that says, yes, I'm interested in this new position. Yes, I want to take it. Or yes, I want to take the next step, be considered for this position. I can hold that image clearly, and I know that I'm emanating, I don't know, good vibes, energy, whatever. And as I shuffle the deck, it's not just my hands moving the cards, right? This tangible energy around me. Go listen to the Bellabog stuff, because that's what this is all about as well, is that the electromagnetic field is sort of a manifestation and representation of this aura around the individual, around the society, around the group of people. It's this poetic halo that I talk about and write about. So the tarot deck is an opportunity for that to get engaged. And so what I actually did, I took the major arcana, and I shuffled them, and then I would set them aside, and then I played some piano, but I practiced. I took a part of some Schubert that I'm working on. To practice that, you have to be slow and deliberate, careful, thoughtful, steady in the mind, steady in the hand. So I practiced, I would drink a bit of tea, and then I would shuffle again. And I just kind of did that cycle for maybe 20 minutes. Really playing, practicing, settling in, thinking about so I said, what would it be like if I took this next step? And then at a certain point, I'd either had enough, or I was happy with how the playing was going along. So I took the card that was on the top, turned it over, and then that would be my card. And it was the Fool, just the first card, and that's a great card. It convinced me to take this seriously, or rather, I should say, it said, if I'm going to take this seriously, then with this card, I should send the email and follow along, because for me, this card has always meant moving into the future. Not stupidly. The Fool is not a stupid character, I don't think. And this is where you read the cards differently. Some people might see the Fool and think he's not paying attention. His dog's trying to stop him from going off the edge of a cliff, and he's about to walk off a cliff. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it as a man and his dog taking a step with no encumbrances of expectation, other than universal clarity and safety, security. I don't think he's falling off a cliff. I think he's letting go of previous expectations and thoughts. The Fool is always shown with a dog, and I realized as I was looking at this card that, without meaning to, a few years ago, over the course of a couple of years, I got a bunch of tattoos, but two of them on my arm. One of them is the Red Hat Stickman that I've talked about. You often see him as an avatar for work that I do. And then next to him is an old doodle I did of my dog Buford. And I got the Red Hat Stickman once, and then a year later I thought, I should put my little dog doodle next to him. So I wasn't thinking, let's recreate the tarot deck of the tarot card of the Fool, but that is what's happened. It's a real icon for me, that card. And so I was really strongly encouraged when that card showed up. So, yeah, thank you, Maria, for putting that card in place. I want to go through some notes that I've been working on for an essay, one of the essays that's going in the collection that I think I'm going to start referring to as Essays on the Nature of Imagination. Not a particularly exciting title, but it's an honest one. And part of a sort of recurring thread in the essays is what happens when you are confronted with art. What impact does it have on the physical, on the physiological, as well as the emotions? But then why does it have a physiological impact? And and what are the nuances of that impact? And it comes down for me to the sense of a confrontation with ideas that force you to extend beyond your current, beyond my current, beyond your, beyond our current frame of reference. So, art that is very, very big, or that requires you to imagine yourself to be in a place or a position that is not possible. Like you have to be 3 miles above the surface of the earth, or you have to live for 10,000 years to see the full scope of the piece. Or in poetry, you have to be in a particular frame of mind that is not current. And so to get in that frame of mind means accepting that your frame of mind currently is not anything more than that. It's just a current frame of mind. So these layers of confrontation have layers of reaction. So I write about these, and I came across an essay by the poet A.E. Housman, where he talks about the nature of poetry, and actually it's a short essay. It's actually the publication in Monograph of a lecture that he gave. I've got the information right here. It's the Leslie Stevens lecture delivered at Cambridge in 1933. He was actually A. Housman was actually a professor of Latin, and was not known as a poet, with one extraordinary exception, which is the collection called A Shropshire Lad. A Shropshire Lad? Shit, I don't have the book. I can never remember whether the set is called The Shropshire Lad or A Shropshire Lad, because it's such an iconic collection now that you could almost say it's The Shropshire Lad, where the is like the book. So if the title is The Shropshire Lad, you would really be saying it's the Shropshire Lad, or the A Shropshire Lad. I've already got it wrong. I'm just going to give it up. I'm going to call it Shropshire Lad. So I was reading last summer. I read through this over the course of a week, and also had a book by Peter Parker, with particular attention to the publication of and the reception of this book of poems. It's unfair to say that Housman didn't write any other poetry. He actually wrote, and I admire him for this, he wrote a collection called Last Poems, and that was the title of the book. And then later wrote more poems. I just think that's So I'm going to write a collection of pieces, probably piano pieces, and call them last pieces. And then have a second set comes out later and call them more pieces. Anyway, he was a critic, or he was a scholar of obscure Latin texts. That was really how he made his scholarly name. So the Shropshire Lad was published. Hausman paid for the publication. He was very specific about the rules of publication. It had to be small, it had to be well bound. And it was a book that was taken up tremendously by the youth of the time, particularly soldiers. And if you read the poems, you'll see why so many of the poems are laments for young dead soldiers lost in foreign lands. And all of those young soldiers off to wherever the Boer War or whatever would take a copy of this, put it in their breast pocket. So he wrote this collection. He was famous for this collection, the Shropshire Lad, the Shropshire Lad. And when it comes time for him to describe good poetry, he must be talking about the impact that the poetry like Shropshire Lad has on the reader, which is really a heightened sense of emotion and this physical response. So this physical reaction that you can call horripilation, 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 which is a fantastic word. It's even fun to type it. Right? It's got repeated R's, and then you flip between the P and the I, and then you've got to kind of jump the full octave of the keyboard from the L to the A. Horripilation. The characteristics that Hausman provides to describe the sensations caused by good poetry. So how do you know good poetry? You know good poetry because it will induce the following. This is a quote from the lecture. He gave this lecture to a bunch of academic critics at Cambridge. They must have wondered what the hell was going on. What's good poetry? First, the skin will bristle. Second, a shiver down the spine coordinated with a constriction of the throat and watering eyes. And then finally, a spear through the pit of the stomach. So that's pretty good. Hausman actually doesn't use the word horripilation. Peter Parker uses that. So well played, Peter. It's a great word, horripilation. So how does Hausman get it, right? So in the lecture, he starts by saying three things that poetry is not. It is not versification. So it's not meter, well-formed meter, although that's all great stuff. But that's not the definition of good poetry. It also isn't wit. And this is interesting. Hausman seems a particular disdain for 18th century satire. Dryden. Dryden's the only one I can remember. But this is a quote from the essay, or from the lecture that Hausman says. He says, "The writing of poetry proceeded, and much of the poetry written was excellent literature. But excellent literature, which is also poetry, is not therefore excellent poetry." And I laughed out loud when I read that. I think that's probably one of the funniest things that I've read, because it is such a witty thing to say, and it is clearly not poetry, but it is pretty fucking excellent. And then the third thing that it isn't, poetry is not the attributes around the poem and the poet, and he particularly references Wordsworth, where so many people drawn to Wordsworth's poetry were drawn to the philosophy that Wordsworth and the Romantics talked about, and it was the philosophy that brings them in. And when they read the poems, they're really reacting to the philosophy rather than the poetry. Again, I don't think he's criticizing necessarily the poetic quality of Wordsworth, but that in and of itself, because it's so densely packed. Let me see if I can find here. He actually said something. Here he says. He's starting to positively define poetry. Poetry is not the thing said, but a way of saying it. This is pretty wild. I read this and just it made me tighten my sphincter, which I guess is the sign of good criticism. He points to William Blake, who he says is the most poetical of all poets. Let me read what he says. It's long, but it's really worth it. Here's Hausman talking about Blake, William Blake. I find his lyrical note as beautiful as Shakespeare's, and more beautiful than anyone else's. And I call him more poetical than Shakespeare, even though Shakespeare has so much more poetry, because poetry in him preponderates more than in Shakespeare over everything else. And instead of being confounded in a great river, can be drunk pure from a slender channel of its own. So I guess because Shakespeare has all these other ideas and dramatic aspects and brilliance and greatness other than the poetical, whereas Blake just has the poetical. It's more distilled and more powerful because of that. Hausman goes on to say, Shakespeare is rich in thought, and his meaning has power of itself to move us, even if the poetry were not there. Check this phrase. And he says, Blake's meaning is often unimportant or virtually non-existent, so that we can listen with all our hearing to his celestial tune. Now, isn't that right? So this is gorgeous, a separation of meaning and poetry. And it's true, who the hell knows what Blake is talking about most of the time? But it is poetic. He wraps it up by saying about Blake, the verses which I'm now going to read, he quotes a bunch of Blake. The verses which I'm now going to read probably possessed for Blake a meaning, and his students think that they have found it. But the meaning is a poor, foolish, disappointing thing in comparison to the verses themselves. So that's great. And again, when he says that, I think of this ooze, this glowing halo around art and artifacts that is separate from the object, but is this poetical halo, like the electromagnetic sphere, like the halo that's activated when you do divination with tarot decks. And that's the nature of poetry, right? That's what Hausman is talking about. And then when you are confronted with this, when you are undeniably exposed to information that isn't coming from your currently understood filters of the physiological senses. So unpack that, right? Currently understood filters of the physiological senses. We are used to receiving information in particular ways through sight, sound, touch, smell, whatever else the other senses are. Can't remember. But there's a mind sense, and we're not used to thinking of it that way. And we're not used to thinking of it outside of some chronological input that's very filtered and narrow. So when poetry makes you think beyond that, or when music or some other experience that you're confronted with compels you to imagine yourself outside of those current boundaries, then you experience horripilation, right? Your bowels clench, or your sphincter clenches, your bowels turn watery, whatever Hausman said. Zenglop the podcast. Conversations with an aesthetic alien. A podcast where we talk about music, poetry, and psychogeography.